So tonight, I want to introduce, of course, my name is Linda Gorski, and I'm president of the Houston Archeological Society. And I'd like to welcome you to our November monthly meeting and introduce our speaker, Texas State Marine Archeologist, Amy Borgens. Amy will discuss her experiences rediscovering the foreshore archaeology of the Texas Gulf Coast. Underwater archaeological sites discovered in the state waters include the oldest shipwrecks in the United States, the 1554 Spanish Plate Fleet, and recorded shipwrecks dating to the 17th century French colonization, the Republic of Texas, the Mexican-American War, American Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Often easily overlooked in this diverse array are the shipwrecks that are obvious part of our everyday environment, those embedded in the beach. These discoveries are the most vulnerable of our state shipwreck sites, as they are frequently battered by waves in the surf zone, ravaged by storms, degraded by mollusk consumption, or most unfortunately, targeted by collectors and beachcombers. Amy Borgens was appointed State Marine Archeologist at the Texas Historical Commission in June 2010. As the State Marine Archeologist, she is responsible for the preservation, protection, and investigation of shipwrecks and other submerged sites in all the state-owned waters. She has worked in the field of Texas marine archaeology for more than 2 decades and has been associated with several notable shipwrecks, including Belle and the Westfield. In addition, Amy assisted in the excavations of Oklahoma's only known shipwreck site, the Heroine, and participated in the remotely operated vehicle investigations of early 19th century shipwrecks at depths exceeding 4,000 feet off the Texas-Louisiana coast. Collectively, Amy has recorded historic shipwrecks dating from the Byzantine period to the mid-20th century and has worked on projects in Louisiana, Oklahoma, Texas, Canada, Turkey, and the Gulf of Mexico. Amy earned a bachelor's degree from Purdue University in Fine Arts and received her master's degree in anthropology from Nautical Archaeology program at Texas A&M University. She is currently a doctoral candidate in the Department of Geography at Texas State University. Amy, you're on.
And give me just a second. And you can see my screen?
Yep.
And I want to thank the Houston Archaeological Society and Linda for inviting me to give a talk for your meeting. And this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. It's actually, I'm sort of dovetailing it into my dissertation topic because it's not something that maybe a lot of individuals know as much about. So it's really interesting to communicate about it and introduce other archaeologists and the public to our beach shipwrecks. And so pardon me, this is actually an image I just recently took at Surfside. You know, a lot of times I was on vacation, and when it storms, that can ruin a lot of beach vacations for people, but I get really excited about the potential for photography. So as Linda mentioned, I'm the State Marine Archaeologist at the Texas Historical Commission in the Archaeology Division in the Small Marine Archaeology Program. And I am one of just a handful of specialists at the state level that are in these designated positions at state agencies or sister agencies that are representing the State Historic Preservation Office or officer. And so a large portion of my job is actually a regulatory review. So I look at projects that are being constructed in state public waters, and I determine, or state waters actually, and I just determine whether a survey is needed, and I protect the detected recovery, sorry, I can't even speak this evening. Sorry, I make sure that previously recorded sites are protected from construction, and I also ask for surveys to make sure that sites that have not yet been discovered have the potential to be located and protected from construction activities. So let me minimize this screen real quickly. So Texas jurisdictional waters, we have about 367 linear miles of coast extending 3 leagues, which is about 10.35 miles into the Gulf. So we have one of the largest jurisdictional areas in the continental United States, because our marine boundary is 3 times the size of almost any other state, with the exception of West Florida. So we have about a little over 5,000 square miles of public waters, in addition to 1,500 square miles of river bottoms. And so one thing that's really exciting about Texas is that we were one of the first states to enact legislation to protect specifically shipwreck archaeological sites in the state. And so we have about 1,912 reported shipwrecks in state waters. And this comes from primary and secondary source material, navigational charts. We have a database where we track this information. And we have about 181 discovered archaeological sites. And of those, about 24 of those are exposed either on the beach or along the riverbanks. And those are the ones that I'm going to be focusing on today. I'm not going to have an opportunity to discuss all 24, but I'm going to highlight the ones that are especially accessible in the beach areas that folks may have a tendency to encounter in a more regular way, just through vacationing. So we have these vessels. We don't have a lot on the beaches in Texas, but we have unique shipwrecks, and we have a really interesting cluster of shipwrecks at Boca Chica Beach, either embedded shipwrecks in the beach or parts that have washed ashore. This is probably one of the most dynamic areas in the state for this activity. We also have vessels in and around Port Aransas, these two here in Corpus Port Aransas area. In Galveston, we have a small collection of shipwrecks that are confirmed to be dated to World War I or believed to date to that period. And then we also have exposed shipwrecks over near Lake Livingston. We have some ferries actually as far north as the Sulphur River in Texas. So these are just a few of the sites that we have in Texas. And then there's large collections of World War II shipwrecks along the banks of the Neches and Sabine Rivers in East Texas. And these images here are about 20 years old. They're not as exposed now as they did used to be, but they're also a hazard to boating. And these are actually marked on navigational charts, these World War I shipwrecks, for that reason. So yeah, just sort of throughout the state of Texas. So one of the reasons I absolutely love discussing beach shipwrecks is because of the dynamic environment that they're buried or encapsulated in. And so what you're looking at here, and this is from Nova Scotia, but it's just sort of an example of a modern vessel from 1999 wrecking on the beach. And what you're seeing here is 3 days of activity. Within 3 days, this shipwreck was buried in its entirety for the most part. And I haven't seen anything as dynamic here in Texas with a modern shipwreck, but I have seen very similar periods of burial, reburial after exposure for archaeological sites on the beach. So I'm going to sort of roll y'all, my audience, through some of the shipwreck archaeology that we have here in the coastal zone and the intertidal areas. And I'm going to start with the Boca Chica Beach, because again, we have, to me, some of the most exciting underwater archaeology in the state in this area. So you're looking here at Port Isabel and Brazos Santiago. These were both established towards the end of the 18th century. Brazos Santiago was kind of more of an informal resort area. This area really started to expand as far as settlements and population, especially in the 19th century. And Matamoros was made the official port of entry in 1823 after Mexico gained independence. And as you'll see, Matamoros is pretty far inland. So if you wanted to bring cargoes in, you would bring them into the port of Brazos Santiago, right at the entrance of Brazos Santiago Pass. And then cargoes would be offloaded at Brazos Santiago and then brought overland up to Matamoros. And this is before steam vessel traffic on the river enabled other ways to bring cargo up that far. So here's the Rio Grande River, and you're looking at Brazos Santiago Pass. And beginning in 1980, this is when the THCs first started getting notifications of some of these beach wrecks. And so you'll see the naming convention is pretty uninspired and uncreative. So Boca Chica #1 was brought to our attention in 1980. Another wreck, this one's actually nicknamed the Miles Wreck. This was a vessel that came upon the shore in pieces in 1983. Another full hold wreck, Boca Chica #2 in 1999 was brought to our attention. And then in 2016, we had pieces of a shipwreck wash ashore for the entire distance of the beach at Boca Chica Beach. And I'm going to talk a little bit at length about Boca Chicas 1, 2, and 3 moving into this talk. And the interesting thing is, even though these vessels came to our attention beginning in the 1980s, they were recognized before that time. And looking at old newspaper articles like this and some others, many of these were exposed in 1967 by Hurricane Beulah. And in one of them here, there was an attempt at this point in time made by a local gentleman who went and surveyed all 3 wrecks. There was one that was of greater interest to him, and he tried to arrest the site, actually, and claim the site at this time in 67. And this was prior to our antiquities law in 1969. And so this particular wreck that you see in these images has actually not been uncovered. We have not relocated this particular shipwreck as yet, and it became reburied, and it, to our knowledge, has not been addressed since that time. So, you know, even though we're learning about these shipwrecks later, it looks like there was continuous sediment removal following storms like this, you know, the cycle of burial and reburial, burial, reburial with these hurricanes throughout history. So the first of these Boca Chica shipwrecks that was brought to our attention is Boca Chica #1. And pardon me, this was exposed in 67 after Beulah, brought to our attention in 1980. And then we went out and did basic recording of the site, essentially getting its orientation, its length and width. It's about 88 by 20 feet. So as you can see, a very long and narrow vessel that had been burned to the waterline. And this was, had what you can see here, a wooden hull with what we call trunnels. It's spelled treenail. It can actually be spelled trunnel as well, but these are essentially wooden dowels that were used as fasteners. And coal was also found within the hull, and this was believed to be potentially part of its cargo. And what you're seeing here is there is an organism that eats wood in sort of warmer, more temperate saltwater environments. And when a wooden hull shipwreck is exposed in the water column, it just gets consumed down to the sediment line. And so that's what you're seeing here is what's left of the shipwreck after this mollusk consumption, and then also just damage from being in the surf and on the beach. These are very, very vulnerable areas for shipwreck sites. And you're seeing images here from 1988 and 1980. So the interesting thing about this particular shipwreck was Boca Chica #2, as you'll see when I talk about it here in a moment, has sort of constantly been exposed. And we were being, this wreck was being reported to us a lot, whereas Boca Chica #1, after the second visit in 1980. So we went and reported the wreck in 1980, revisited it in 1988, and then we had not heard of this wreck being uncovered until December of 2017. And by this time, having the job as long as I've had it now, I actually realized that if you don't get to the coast immediately when there's a wreck report, it may be reburied before you actually get to do a site visit. So I received the report on a Sunday. I went to work on Monday, tried to get everything finished for the week. I didn't know how long I'd be out there, and then arrived on Tuesday. So what you're seeing in that upper image is what the site looked like just 2 days after that image was taken there. And you're seeing the run of the tips of the frame on the starboard side and the stern post sort of centrally, which is just right in the water line there in the surf zone. And so we went out, and originally we had hopes of trying to find the bow, the stem post of this wreck. And because we knew the orientation and we knew the distance, we measured 88 feet and we were just unable to dig and find that immediately. So what you're seeing in the lower image is us sort of digging down and finding the tips of the frames to see if we could define the vessel and relocate the bow. But and we're taking GPS positions for the frames and for other major components of the vessel. But by the time we got to the area of the stem, the bow, which you're seeing on the right-hand side of your image, we were already, I believe, about 2 feet deep into beach sand. And if any of y'all have ever tried to dig in beach sand, it's very dense, it's very difficult to dig into. And because you're below the water table, it's backfilling with water the entire time. So we were just unable to reach the timbers for the bow of the vessel just because of the depth of burial and just the difficulty in working in that area. So Boca Chica #2 is, we probably have more information and more monitoring of this particular shipwreck in the coastal zone than any other site in underwater site in the state of Texas. So this was brought to the attention of the THC in 1999 because beach cleaners were removing timbers from the wreck because it was not recognized to be a shipwreck site. And so this, my predecessor, Steve Hoyt, was contacted and went down immediately, pretty much issued a cease and desist order on the beach cleaning in this area. And then you're seeing right there, one of the pieces that was removed, which is a hanging knee. And he did basic documentation, photo documentation of the vessel at that time. And you can see that this is obviously occurring after a storm because the beach sand has been scoured right up to the dune line. And so this is a pretty frequently occurring activity here in Texas in the wintertime, and not just from hurricanes, but you can have similar types of environmental impacts to the shoreline from these storms, not just hurricanes, but also northers as well. So again, reported to us in 1999. We went out, our volunteers mapped it in 2002, the exposed part of the wreck. And my predecessor, Steve Hoyt, went out separately from that and also mapped in the stern. So this is slightly smaller than Boca Chica #1 at 73 feet by 23 feet. And it's also wooden hulled, as you can see here, with the trunnial fastenings, so wood fastenings, and it's double framed, which means some vessels are single framed and some have paired spaced framing here. And we have a lot of photography for this wreck, some taken by our own staff, but also in recent years, as I've been talking more publicly about this wreck, and especially I try to attend when I can the Texas Archaeology Month. It's hosted in Brownsville by Palo Alto National Battlefield National Park. And just by doing more public outreach, I'm getting more feedback and I'm getting more donated imagery of these wrecks. So that's pretty exciting. So this is the work that was conducted in 2002. And again, they tried to dig out some areas of the vessel, like the stern you see here. And the image in the middle was the original map that was created in 2002. And what I did a few years ago was I added the stern section that had been mapped by Steve Hoyt just in, I want to say, a few months prior to the activity you're seeing here. And I added that to the map. And there's a tremendous amount of photo documentation. Steve Hoyt actually walked down the center line of the vessel and fully documented the port and starboard side framing. And because we know the dimensions of the framing and the frame spacing, what you're seeing on the right is an interpretive reconstruction of what the hull would look like, to the best of my ability, just to tell a sort of a fuller story. And again, that's Steve Hoyt's recorded stern, and the areas that are highlighted here in brown are from the original mapping, and then I've just added to that. So again, probably one of the most complete shipwreck hulls that we have in the state as well. And so this image here, I just want to help y'all as the viewers sort of understand what level of preservation we are seeing on the shipwreck site. Because when you're looking at that image on the other upper left and some of the other images that have been taken, it may not be quite so obvious. So I tried to find a similar vessel. This is from 1831, the USS Boxer, though this is not a naval vessel. But so what you're seeing here is the main mast, the foremast, and we know from the portion that's exposed above the waterline that there's at least an additional 4.5 feet of the mast, because we actually have this mast now, this foremast, and there's probably an additional, I'd say maybe 2 feet that lies beneath the foremast there. So right now in these images that you're seeing, you're talking about a potential 6 to 7 feet of additional burial under the sediment, in addition to what's exposed above the sediment line. We have the bowsprit bit here. And then these objects that I have circled, those are the hanging knees. And the reason that those are important is because that actually supports the deck that you walk on. And then you have these timbers that were the support for the gunnels, for the sides of the vessel. So what you're looking at here is essentially a majority of the lower part of the hull. It's just that the deck is missing and any superstructure above the deck. And why that's missing, there's a bunch of different explanations for why we don't have those components of the ship. But one thing you do sometimes see, and we have anecdotal accounts for this, is that any of y'all that have been on the South Texas coast or the Texas coast in general will understand that there's a real lack of hardwood in the coastal zone. And so it ends up that these shipwrecks were often mined for timber for construction and also iron and other metals. So again, like this could have been salvaged, and at the time it could have been salvaged for timber, or just the activity of the waves and surf could have taken these timbers off and taken them out to sea. Sorry, I forgot the stern post here as well. And sorry, I got ahead of myself, but this is part of the chain plate as well. So quite a few attributes from the shipwreck that you can see in these images. So these shipwrecks, the Boca Chica shipwrecks, in particular, Boca Chica #2, is really well known locally. It's because of its constant exposure on a touristy beach. And it developed a reputation for being the remains of the Mexican gunboat Montezuma. It's also, this vessel went by 3 names: Moctezuma, Montezuma, and Bravo. And the images that you're seeing here used to be posted on Google Earth with the identification of the shipwreck. And I actually emailed them at one point in time and tried to get these images removed, just because I didn't want people to use them to try to find the shipwrecks, just because by state law, positions of shipwrecks are protected information. And when I clicked on one of those images, my predecessor, Steve Hoyt, had actually made a memo in the photo to remind viewers that these wrecks are protected. And both Boca Chicas 1 and 2 are state antiquity landmarks. And so I thought that was really great on his behalf that he commented on someone else's photo just to remind people that these are protected archaeological sites. So Montezuma is extremely famous in Texas Navy history. It was part of a revitalized Mexican Navy leading into the Texas Revolution. It was constantly patrolling the Texas coast, and the Texas Navy was created in part to find this vessel and hunt it down and sink it. And so the shipwreck, or not the shipwreck, but the Texas Navy vessel, which is actually a shipwreck, but at this point in time, Invincible was in pursuit of Moctezuma and finally found it on the Brazos Santiago bar with missing its rudder. And they were in the process of trying to repair the rudder. The crew on the Texas Navy vessel disguised themselves as a revenue cutter and actually got a crew member aboard in an effort to gather Mexican intel. And unfortunately, he was exposed. They were caught, and a naval conflict ensued. And so the interesting thing about this affair is that before Moctezuma was sunk, Invincible left. It saw 2 other vessels pursuing Brazos Santiago, suspected they were carrying contraband, assumed that Moctezuma was going to sink, and just left it aground on the bar. And so, and I wrote a really long article about this, that part of the reason that we know that this vessel cannot be the Montezuma Bravo is, first of all, Boca Chica #2 is located about midway down the beach, not on the Brazos Santiago bar. Secondly, the construction of the vessel does not lend itself to a Mexican Navy ship. And there's a big question as to whether Montezuma even sank. When you look at primary sources, the Mexican Navy says that they were going to be able to get it off of the bar and that it wasn't really damaged by this military engagement. And so the Texans claim they sank it. The Mexican Navy claims that it was not sunk. And you actually see accounts of a vessel with this name for at least 3 years after its supposed sinking. And so this is a really complex history for Montezuma Bravo. But in addition to not even knowing whether or not this vessel sank, there's just a lot of other evidence that does not support Boca Chica #2 being this Mexican Navy warship. And the unfortunate thing about its fame is it's led to the belief that this is a Mexican Navy ship has led to unlawful salvage of the site. And so what you're seeing here on the lower left is its foremast. That's this object here. It was removed in 2010 by locals who wanted to have it carved into a bird as a souvenir. And luckily for this archaeological site, the person they took it to recognized it, saved it, and it ultimately made its way back to the Texas Historical Commission. So Boca Chica #3, I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail for this site. I just sort of stuck with the naming convention. This was brought to our attention in 2016. It was reported by the Border Patrol to Rolando Garza of National Park Service, who called me, and I asked our steward to go check out what was going on the beach, because I was getting different stories, like that it was a shipwreck, that maybe it was Boca Chica #2 breaking apart, that it was a shrimper. And when he got out there, what you're seeing on the left are the images that he took with his phone. And I've had someone look at this before and said, wow, are there parts of a shipwreck in the back of his truck? And the answer to that is yes. And that's very unconventional. That's not something that's normally done with an archaeological site, even a site like this, which is a secondary deposit. But part of the reason that he rescued those timbers, and you're seeing some of these images on the upper right, is because after the storm passed, people were collecting them and they were burning this shipwreck as bonfire wood. So he actually collected these pieces for us and stored them on his property so that we could examine them. And those are some of the images that you're seeing on the grass. Those are at his house near Boca Chica Beach. You're looking at sort of coupled lodging these in the upper image. And just, this is just pieces, frames, outer hull planking, mostly disarticulated shipwreck, and then a few larger sections like that one in the left. That's about 20 feet long, that section there, which is a section of framing. So yeah, about 44 pieces of the shipwreck. The largest is 6 by 20, and again, wooden hull, trunnel fastened, and single framing. And again, this washed ashore for the entire distance of the beach. And in talking to the underwater archaeologists in Mexico, it looked like they were getting similar reports for material culture washing ashore on their beaches as well. And the unfortunate thing is, I really don't know where this wreck is offshore. There's not that organism that consumes wood. There's not a lot of that damage on these timbers, which pretty much suggests that wherever it is buried. And there was some really unusual storm activity that brought this material to the beach. And I'm actually working with the Texas General Land Office and Texas A&M University, and they're trying to do some hindcast modeling for us to get a better sense of where these things may have been coming from. So I'm not going to go through all this information here, but the reason I generated this table was because I really wanted to make sure that we weren't seeing parts of Boca Chica 1 and 2 with some of these other disarticulated pieces that were coming ashore. So we have, when you look at the framing dimensions, which is the third row from the bottom, and you'll see these frames are different sizes for each of these vessels, especially the Miles wreck, where you're looking at almost 10 by 11 inch frames. Those are it's a really, really robustly built boat. And we've been conducting timber analysis when we can on all of these, which has given us some ideas of where they may have been constructed. But again, like the other issue with these shoreline wrecks is they're often salvaged historically, in addition to modern salvage and to the damage that they sustain being in the coastal zone. And so there's often not much in the way of artifacts or other material culture that can help us identify these shipwrecks. And I think in this area, I want to say that we have about 40 to 50 reported shipwrecks. A lot more at Brazos Santiago Pass, but from Boca Chica Beach down to the mouth of the Rio Grande River, there's about 40 to 50 reported shipwrecks in that area. And another thing I like to highlight here is by having all of the photography we have for Boca Chica #2, you can watch this vessel slowly migrate into the intertidal zone as we're losing shoreline. And, you know, and sometimes you're going to see variability in the inundation of the site, and that's just based on, you know, whether it's high or low tide or how long, you know, after the storm has scoured the beach, like when you visited the site. But we did go back, and let me see, I want to, yeah, there was a field school that was planned, and it did not happen because once a shipwreck is in the intertidal area in the surf zone, it's very, very difficult to excavate and record. Yeah, so we went out, I've been out in 2011, 2016, 2017, after storms. And so the last time this vessel was actually observed was in 2009. And with Boca Chica #1 on the far right, we don't have as much documentation for that, but there is a lot of coastal loss in Texas. In the United States, Texas is, I want to say, the second in the nation for coastal erosion as far as shoreline loss. And on the South Texas coast, that is one of the hardest hit areas. And so even with Boca Chica II, though we don't have successive, almost annual photography for a decade like we did with Boca Chica #2, there's still evidence of this shoreline loss. And one of the things that I thought was the most telling was when this was brought to our attention in 1980, it was on public land, and the mean high water line is the demarcation between state land and private property. And now it is on public land, so it's no longer on private property. It's the state's management issue now. So I'm going to move from the largest collection of shoreline wrecks to probably one of the most interesting ones we have. And so what we have is called an anti-torpedo raft. This is a Civil War era shipwreck section. It's not really a ship, but it's a ship feature. And the torpedo was used with some success during the Civil War. The very first vessel that was sunk by a torpedo, which is a fancy name for a mine, an underwater mine, was the USS Cairo in 1862. And they were also used, famously used at the Battle of Mobile Bay, hence the expression, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, or it's a little bit of paraphrasing of the original phrase, but yeah, the 9 of the 18 Union warships at this battle were sunk by torpedo. And so the first experimentation with these underwater mines occurred in 1861. By 1862, they were mining the James River. And by late 1862, the barrel torpedo was invented. And that's the sort of the most famous type of Civil War underwater mine. So as you might imagine, the Union response to the development of this technology was to try to create a way to protect their ships from these detonations. And so what you have is the Eriksson obstruction remover or boot jack. And so essentially this was a raft that was designed to affix to the bow of the ship. And John Eriksson's a famous Swedish-American inventor at the time. He sort of donated his time and talents to the US Navy, created this concept. There were 4 of these prototypes that were taken by sea, towed behind a vessel for the Charleston campaign in 1863. And 3 of these were lost at sea during the voyage. And the first one that was actually used of these 4 was used on the Monitor, the USS Oaxacan in 1863, but it wasn't employed. Like, they found that the water was rough and the raft was banging against the hull of the ship so much by that wave action, they cut it loose and it drifted ashore to Morris Island. And so of these 3 rafts that came loose or were cut loose, of these 4, so the 3 that came loose, the one that was cut loose, there are archaeological sites for the one at Morris Island, and that's just another image of it on the Oaxacan, and also Bermuda. And so that's what you're seeing here. So these are the two non-Texas sites in Morris Island, South Carolina, and also in Dolly's Island, Bermuda. And they measure about 12.5 by 5 feet in 2010, 50 by 27, the example in Bermuda. So this one is very nearly the full size of the design size of the raft. And when it washed ashore in 1868. And this is what it looks like just a few years ago now. It's actually become part of the environment, which is again, sort of another not unusual situation for shipwrecks that are in coastal areas. Like we have, like the shipwrecks that we have that are in the Sabine and Neches rivers, the ones that are along the riverbank and the Neches rivers have actually grown into the environment and have trees on them. So not unusual to see them becoming a part of the foliage. This is the example that we have here in Texas. This was uncovered by Hurricane Allen in 1980, but was known locally prior to that discovery, and it was investigated in 1985 by archaeologists from the Corpus Christi Museum, the Texas Historical Commission, and the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, which is Texas A&M University, and that was sponsored by the Corpus Christi Museum of Science and History. And this shipwreck portion has not been, to my knowledge, reinvestigated since that time. And so we're hoping to go out. It may actually be captured. I'm still waiting to kind of find out. It may be captured as part of a cultural resource management survey that's planned, but if that doesn't occur, I would love for us to see where this is now, especially, again, the southern Texas coast. We just have so much shoreline erosion in those areas. And so, again, would you look at this on the beach and see all this exposed, these 3 bolts? Would you think that this was a Civil War shipwreck? And would you know that it's one of 3 such archaeological sites in the world? This is part of the mapping that was conducted. And then Tom Ertling, who was involved in that project, built the reconstructive model that you see in the lower right. And so he's got sort of an area there that represents the bow of the ship, and then you can sort of see the raft as it's sort of chained or attached to the bow of the vessel. Just another view of that model. So again, very robustly built so that it could withstand the explosive power of a detonating mine. Now, Lake Austin, I actually learned about this shipwreck from a talk given to my predecessor, Steve Hoyt, at the Society for Historical Archaeology. And this is really an amazing vessel. And again, it's representative of one of the most frequently used scow fishing schooners in the Gulf of Mexico. So this is representative of the Gulf centerboard scow schooner. It was built in 1881 in Matagorda Bay, about 60 feet long, and just worked predominantly along the Texas coast. And there's an account that suggests that this may have been a vessel by this name, Lake Austin, was the first rescue ship to reach Galveston after the hurricane of 1900. So as with many of the shipwrecks losses in Texas, that while traveling during a storm in November of 1903, it encountered a norther and then became damaged in that storm, started to take on water, and was intentionally run aground. It was carrying a cargo of timber, of lumber. And so it was run aground and salvaged to some extent, but just left on the beach. And then later in 1967, it was uncovered by heavy seas. And so these are images that were actually donated to the Texas Historical Commission by the Port Aransas Museum, showing this vessel as it became uncovered, and crews started working to unbury the remainder of the hull. And the difficulty with this wreck, a lot of times in Texas anyway, if there's a shipwreck that's becoming exposed on the beach, it's almost like the first response, the first gut reaction that people have is they want to think that it's a Spanish galleon or Lafitte vessel. And so there was real excitement at that time to expose and uncover this vessel, but then as they started to uncover it, and you can see this, and I don't know if you all are familiar with what a scow barge looks like, but this very boxy hull is that scow shape. And so this was, again, a fishing schooner. On the second day of work, they found the vessel's registration number and were able to identify it as Lake Austin. You can see in the image on the left, they're actually advertising this, the name of the vessel, as they're uncovering it. And what ended up happening was it was burned. So to my knowledge, this is the one of the best, if not best preserved examples of a Gulf scow schooner in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And because there was not a preservation plan or curation plan for the shipwreck, when they exposed this 60-foot long hull, they had nowhere to place it. And if you're familiar with what timber looks like beach timber, any kind of waterlogged timber looks like, once it dries out, it becomes warped and disfigured. And so if you have a wooden hull, you have to keep that wet to preserve that timber until you can conserve that in a controlled manner to slowly dehydrate it and then replace that water with a bulking agent. And so because there wasn't a mechanism to do that, and this was in the late 1960s, before the enactment of our state law that protected these antiquities, the community that had been so excited about exposing this wreck just did not know what to do with it. It was burned on the beach. And I'll never forget hearing this talk at a conference in an audience of marine archaeologists, underwater archaeologists, and just when Steve Hoyt mentioned that this had been burned, hearing this collective audible gasp, and then the silence, you could hear a pin drop, just the shock that a site, and again, like, these sites are so unusual in these saltwater environments to have this level of preservation. And the reason this is so well preserved is because when it's buried in the sand, it's an anaerobic environment, and those organisms can't live in that environment for very long. And so, yeah, just one of our most interesting wrecks, probably, again, one of the best preserved shipwrecks in Texas, and one of our really tragic losses. So what's interesting about this wreck, and part of the reason that we had sort of a data sharing program with the Port Aransas Museum, is they decided to make a reconstruction of a centerboard schooner, a Gulf scow schooner, modeling it on what we know of Lake Austin, and also design plans created by famous historian Howard Chappell in 1941. And so the Farley Boat Works, which is associated with the Port Aransas Museum, started building a reproduction of this type of vessel. And then unfortunately, Hurricane Harvey struck in August of 2017. And the irony is, this vessel was untouched. And those of you that are from Texas know that Port Aransas and Rockport were pretty much ground zero for the storm and the worst damages and impacts from that storm. And so it's really miraculous that this vessel, this reconstruction, survived the storm. And I'm pretty sure it's completed now. You can go to their website. They used to kind of run a regular update on the progress of this vessel, but I haven't had an opportunity. I'm kind of waiting for more information from the museum to see where they are. But I'm assuming by this time, the last time I spoke with them, all that was left to do was the rigging for this reconstruction. I only have two more sites I'm going to discuss with you today. I'm not going to provide a lot of information on these two sites. One of them is rather new, and we're still collecting data and research on it. This particular site, this dugout site, is important to talk about because it's a unique type of archaeological site. It's a canoe. To my knowledge, it's the only canoe that we have in the state of Texas that actually is provenient to an archaeological site. I think we have close to, I want to say 10 or 11. The THC is actually doing an inventory project right now to try to determine which museums have canoes, if any of these are indigenous. We're getting wood species analysis and dating to determine the age. And so, so far, all the canoes that have been located so far are not in their original environment, that they drifted ashore and were donated to collections. So the thing with this site is it was reported to us back in 2010, and you're not seeing the dugout in these images because back in 2010, we did not know that there was a dugout canoe. I got an email from a gentleman that was a regular tourist at the beach that saw these pilings that you see on the left, and he thought it was a shipwreck. So I went out with our volunteers. That's Bill Pearson, who's running a terrestrial magnetometer survey. And again, we were out there within weeks, but as you can tell, this is when I learned, this project, how quickly a site reburies on the beach. And so we recorded all of the timbers that were still projecting from the sand in a mag survey to determine that everything's sort of contained in this area. But the exposed pilings, I want to say, were sort of traversed the shoreline for a distance of about 120 feet parallel and into the surf zone, and but not a shipwreck. And what you're seeing in that lower image that I'm holding in my hand on the left is at the base of one of these pilings, there was a cloth insulated electrical wire of the type that were being used in the 1920s and 30s. And because we knew that there had been development at that time at this location, in this general location, we just thought that this was part of the 20th century archaeology of this beach and kind of went on our merry way. And then fast forward to 2018, I get an email while I was at the Texas Archeological Society conference with photos of a dugout canoe. And I immediately left the next day, very early, around 6 in the morning, so that I could get there at low tide to examine this wreck. I learned from Gene Gore, who reported this to me. He was under the assumption it would be buried within about 3 days and that it was only visible at low tide. And so the two images you're seeing on the left are what he emailed to me. And while we were driving down the beach, like on the way there, I knew exactly where I was. I immediately started recognizing the region, and I knew this was a site that we had visited in 2010, but I was unable to confirm that until I got back into the office and just started, geo-referencing and some of the, just started mapping some of these plots in ArcGIS. And so what you're seeing here is the dugout canoe, which is a central image, and Gene Gore's dog. He was really happy. He came out when we were looking at it, and you're seeing these pilings again that are projecting out of the beach, and there were the remnants of 3 intact casks or barrels in addition to the dugout, and there was other artifact material culture as well. And the barrels, I don't know the purpose for those. I don't know if that was an aspect of the terrestrial site itself. In some coastal areas, barrels could be used to make makeshift wells. The image at the bottom that you're seeing, Gene Gore had a friend come out and collect drone footage, and so that was donated to the agency as well. And these are just more images of the site. So you have the dugout there, and let me see, I don't know if you can see it very well, but see if I can, this timber right here wasn't a mast, but it was cylindrical and long like a mast, and that was exposed for a length of about 35 feet before it became buried, and we were unable to continue digging it out. But just a handful of artifacts. There was a type of mini ball and 2 Luger bullet casings there as well. And the radiocarbon dating for this canoe, I want to say it places it in the second half of the 19th century, which is what we were sort of suspecting it might be, just sort of based on the use history of this area. And but the other thing that I was kind of interested in is you have a dugout, and it's on the Gulf side of this site. And so you have a dugout that looks like it's at a 19th century site, where part of the larger matrix of this archaeological site is a 20th century site. So this is a very complex, larger archaeological site. We have not had an opportunity to go back out and remap it. I'm literally waiting for another storm event to expose more timber so we can see if we can identify what this site is. But one of the things that I was interested in is you can see here that as the tide's coming back in, there's almost this natural inlet coming into this shallow water area. And it somewhat made me wonder how, like, the timbers are obviously, the pilings were intentionally placed at this location, but I was curious as to whether some of the other objects, like the canoe or these other glass and ceramic fragments, are actually associated with the site, or if they were just brought to the site by current action. So the last site I'm going to talk about today is kind of a hot off the press archaeological site. This was reported earlier in October. I was actually on another project at the time this report came in, and the image that you see on the left was forwarded to the THC, and I went out and visited it on Halloween with the, and it was actually kind of a neat way we learned about it. A gentleman that was out there fishing told a friend who worked at one of our historic sites, who told a friend that happened to be one of our volunteers, who communicated it to me. And then I came out as soon as we were all able to meet on a Saturday and visit the site. So this is what I encountered the morning of October 30th on Halloween. And again, at high tide, this is underwater. And one thing I'm going to point out to you, that this area of the beach is typically has a lot of dunes, and because of whatever storm activity had passed through this area recently, this entire part of the beach was devoid of dunes. All of that had been carried and essentially sheared away by the winds and the waves. And so, and like, again, he's gonna, I'm supposed to be sent more imagery. This is an ongoing project, so I can sort of see what this area looked like prior to the recent storms. And you can see here that this is actually kind of embedded in, a clay or a clay loam. And my first thought was that this may have drifted ashore, but then when I got to the site, it looks like this has been there for a long time. And that's another phenomenon that you can have with these beach wrecks. You can have shipwrecks that run aground that become embedded, and then their upper portions they degrade over time, either based on salvage or based on environmental factors. But you can also have a ship that breaks apart due to the wrecking event, and then those pieces come ashore and they become embedded and buried as well. And our volunteers looked up and down the beach. We didn't find any other evidence of any other associated timbers from this particular section. So the image on the left is what it looked like before we uncovered it. And the images on the right are the volunteers that were nice enough to report direct to me helping dig it out. I think they think that all I do is make people dig now. But we had a lot of fun on a Saturday exposing this so that we could get basic measurements and see what sort of other features were recognizable. And this is, we uncovered about 2/3 of it. And, so what you're looking at here, these are double frames. So these are about 2 by 5 inches, like 2 inches, 2 inches. And then you have about a foot spacing here. And then this is outer, so you have outer hull planking, which is the part that you really can't see. You can see it here. And then what you see here is called ceiling. So this is the inner planking that would have been at the base of the hull of the ship that you would walk on if you were in this sort of cargo area of the vessel. And then what you see here is a stringer, kind of a longitudinal, like much thicker, wider timber, kind of a longitudinal strengthening timber, sort of at the turn of the bilge on this vessel. So what you're looking at here is the side of the ship. So this is the side of the ship here, if you could see my mouse that I'm waving around, and then it's curving into the base of the vessel. So the keel and keelson, that center line would have been probably up in here somewhere. And I'm just showing this image just to show you again, like how the sand was just stripped away in areas to the clay line. And then what you're seeing here is a shrimp boat that's, I think it's this one is a sailboat. There were 2 wrecks right next to this, a modern sailboat, which you see here. And underneath that is actually the full hull of the sailboat. You just can't see, it's not exposed. And there was an older shrimp boat as well. And then in this area here, this probe is delineating the very end of the still buried part of the shipwreck. And so after we documented it and took photography, we reburied this because, again, once it's exposed, it can be consumed by organisms. And historic wood is actually buoyant, like once you uncover it. And so we reburied it to kind of help it remain in place and to protect it from that tornado consumption. And I'm hoping that this one seems to be, it's been there, it hasn't moved in the last month. And so we're going to try to monitor this with the help of our volunteers locally. And I have wood samples so that we can do more analytical studies, try to identify the wood. In many cases with these historic ships, we expect to find oak frames and pine planking, but I'm willing to be surprised. And so again, there's more stuff on the roster for this particular chunk of a shipwreck. And that's the end of my discussion on, and again, these are just some of the examples of the types of shipwrecks we have here on the Texas coast that folks can encounter. I encourage anyone to call me and report a wreck so that we can try to gain the information that we can while we still have it, because these can have a fairly short lifespan, especially once they are in that intertidal area just because of environmental factors. And just sort of as a reminder here, and I know that those of y'all in the Houston Archaeological Society are aware of this, but archaeological sites on state public land are protected. We don't allow salvage of shipwrecks in Texas waters. If there any artifact recovery is to occur or is proposed, any kind of excavation, that's a permitted activity in the state of Texas. And the laws that cover and address archaeological sites and shipwreck archaeology, those differ from state to state. But in Texas, that's just not something that we allow here. And as an additional reminder, metal detecting is not allowed in federal or state parks. You can metal detect on public beaches, but again, you cannot recover artifacts or disturb or try to salvage an archaeological site on the beach. It's just difficult. I think sometimes with these public areas, there's sort of a finders keepers mentality, and people recover and remove things. But it's, again, that's just not, that's not in compliance with state law. And we just prefer to have that material culture left there and sort of as in situ preservation. And if you have any interest, I did a quick write-up on the dugout canoe. And again, you'll find that in this talk and in this article, it's really devoid of any kind of identifying information for this wreck, where it's located, who even the participating partners were with us. And it's because this area is already attracted a lot of attention, and there's a lot of metal detecting in this area. And so we're just trying to protect this ship, this dugout and this larger site as much as we can. And this is that sort of gargantuan article that I wrote about the work that was done on Boca Chica, and then sort of explaining the conundrum of the Montezuma wreck, the different Montezumas. There were different vessels that went by that name. It went by different names. And that these are both free and online. You can find them at these links. And just in general, if you have any interest in any of our Texas archaeological sites, just let me know, and I can send you any of the public articles we have. And and if it's an archaeological site that has a cultural resource management report, I can work on getting you a redacted copy or redacting a copy of that report for you. So I want to thank you again for having me here today, and just to allow me to talk about these really, really exciting, lesser known archaeological sites that are on the Texas coast.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Amy. If anyone has any questions, just type them into the chat box down there and we'll get your questions to Amy. It'll be less chaotic than everybody unmuting.
Amy, that was really interesting, and I really appreciate your taking time to do it. I know this is a busy time of year for you.
Well, and it is, and I'll tell you that the hurricane season can be a busy time of year for me, because if we're going to have exposure of these coastal wrecks, that's more often than not when it occurs. And I try to do the best that I can with the help of my volunteers, with the stewards, to visit these sites, because again, we only have a really tiny window of opportunity to look at them and evaluate them before they're they're lost to the waves or reburied.
Does anybody have any questions for Amy?
Okay, we've got one. Ashley says, Ian has a question. How many pieces of wood are in a mast? Is it one big log or multiple?
It should be one timber. and they're usually notched at the base, you know, and you can see that some of them, like the ones on the Boca Chica rack, are octagonal, you know, so they're, you know, I think sometimes there's a perception that masts on ships are round, and they often are, but where they're seated into the deck, they can be a different shape, like a octagonal, to kind of help keep it in its position.
Interesting.
But they can also have like really sort of a robust construction features around those masts as well, like a mast step, you know, just to kind of help keep them situated into the lower part of the hull.
Wow.
And like one of the things I wanted to add was Boca Chica number two, when we were able to get that foremast back, the one that was taken off of it, the silver lining and it being removed and getting it back was getting the timber analysis and finding out that it was bald cypress. And so bald cypress suggests that it's a southern manufacturer, like a southern Gulf or Gulf state. But the other problem with that is vessels could get dismasted and you could replace the mast, you know, so yes, that vessel could have been built in a Gulf or southern state as long as that mast was the original mast that was with the ship when it was constructed, and not a replacement mast.
Great. Any other questions before we let Amy get back to work? Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate it. And to my group, if you would like a copy of any of the journals that we just talked about tonight, that I've talked about tonight, everybody has my email. Please email me and I'll get them in the mail to you. And otherwise, anybody else have any announcements? We'll just shut it down and see you next month. Great. Thanks, Amy. See you later, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Linda.
Bye, sweetie. See you soon.
Okay.
Bye. What is that? Good night, John boy. See.